Editing Man, Myth and Magic was an arduous but rewarding experience. It entailed planning and finding expert international contributors for articles from the Aberdeen Witches and the Abominable Snowman to Zoroastrianism and the Zulus, with half of human experience in between. Any project on so massive a scale demands hard work. The reward was the treasure of fascinating information and revealing insights which the articles bring together. In fields as far-ranging as comparative religion, history, anthropology, sociology, art and symbolism, the Encyclopedia covers a gigantic range of speculation, belief and behavior, ranging in scale from the major religions of the world, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, with all that they have brought to human life, down to everyday common superstitions, such as touching wood or throwing spilled salt over one's shoulder. It deals with traditional rituals and ideas across the world, from the peyote cults of American Indians to the sacred dream time of the Australian Aborigines and the cargo cults of the Southern Pacific. 1. Magic, the secret law. The question of magic is a question of discovering and employing hitherto unknown forces in nature. It is impossible to know precisely when human beings first tried to harness these forces. From imitative hunting magic onwards, a whole tradition of magic rituals has developed, with its appendages of gestures and symbols, circles and pentagrams, chants and spells. This secret law can be found in grimoires or spellbooks, and in the theories of the occultists and Kabbalists. 2. Alchemy. The magical mystical doctrines of one, the alchemists, under the name of Hermes Trismegistus, became known as Hermetic philosophy or art, fire and crucible, arcane rituals. The search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life led to the early beginnings of chemistry. The alchemists' attempts to transmute base metals into gold were bound up with their desire to perfect the soul, and a belief that all the varied phenomena of the world are parts of one harmonious whole and permeated by universal spirit. 3. Witches and witchcraft. Although we often think of witches as female, in fact, many cultures have male witches, as people who claim to manipulate the natural world for good or evil. Witches have traditionally carried great authority as seers and wise advisors to people with problems. Witches have inspired not only respect but fear, and this led to such appalling reactions as the witch hunts in Europe and America, in which thousands of witches were put to death. Witchcraft continues to thrive in many cultures around the world. In recent years, there has been a remarkable revival in Europe and America. 4. Devils, demons, and angels. Good and evil, personified as God and the devil in various forms, are found in many cultures. A divided universe implies conflict, an interminable war between the powers of light and darkness, the spirits of heaven and hell. Apocalyptic visions of doomsday and the idea of judgment reflect a common wish to see the good rewarded and the wicked punished, to right the balance most often found in this world. Whether heaven and hell are seen as places or as states of mind, the divided world can be seen as a mirror of the conflict that rages within our own selves. 5. Foretelling the future. Today is tomorrow's yesterday. Hidden within its own intricacies and uncertainties, the longing to gaze into the future is an innate aspect of the human psyche. From ancient prophecies and oracles to modern practices such as astrology and fortune-telling through cards, palms, or tea leaves, the thirst for foresight endures. Perhaps it is a means of influencing events or imprinting a recognizable order on the flow of time, or even a way to convey optimism and trust in brighter days ahead. Regardless of the motivations, fortune-telling takes on numerous forms, each marked by its unique set of regulations and rituals. 6. Birds, plants, and animals. In myth, folklore, human beings have always been fascinated by other living things on Earth. In an all-embracing urge to perceive magic in everything, we have included plants and animals in our belief systems and folk tales, and this has provided us with a precious heritage. Flowers, herbs and trees have accumulated some wonderful stories. They can heal, lull you to sleep, bring you luck, ward off witches, and you can be enchanted in the uncanny forest. A similar tradition applies to animals. They have sometimes shared man's life on the most intimate terms. 7. Nature, fertility, creation myth. Why do the tides ebb and flow? Why is there day and night? What explanation exists for the succession of the seasons, for springtime and harvest, for rain and sun? How was the world created? Man's observation of nature has profoundly influenced his religious ideas and practices, from simple nature worship of trees and water, the sun and the moon, beliefs in a mother goddess and fertility rites, and beliefs in a vegetation spirit that annually dies and rises again. 8. Rites of passage. The major landmarks of human experience, birth, puberty, marriage and death, are celebrated with rituals of powerful emotional resonance. They mark the passage from one stage of life to another, and both celebrate the joys and prepare the individual for the responsibilities and challenges to come. Initiation rites, such as circumcision and ritual tattooing in primitive societies, often involve ordeals of endurance, suffering, and torture. The communal participation in these rituals marks the common experience of humanity in the recurring cycle of the renewal and destruction of life. 9. Symbols and meanings. Men employ symbols when they invoke powerful associations and emotions. Symbols are found in art, drama, and dance, from the earliest dance dramas of hunting rituals reflected in prehistoric cave paintings, to the deliberate use of symbols in paintings, poetry and religious iconography. The cross must be one of the best known of all religious symbols. It is simple and immediately recognizable. Religious architecture can also express a higher meaning. 10. The hero's quest. Human experience has mainly been turbulent and full of struggle. We have felt insignificant when ranged against the immensity of the universe. The other side of impotence is unlimited strength. The slaying of dragons, the daring of Hercules, the valor of Galahad, the visionary knight in search of the Holy Grail. The majority of the human race may be weak and vulnerable, but in many cultures, heroic figures emerge to echo our bravest dreams. 11. Mysterious creatures and lands in myth and legend. The creation of other lands, such as the legendary island of Atlantis, and fabulous creatures to inhabit them, is a natural extension of magical thinking. Fairy tales, myths, and legends are rich in such ideas, and they represent some very powerful archetypes of human experience. Dragons, fairies, ghosts, and harpies lend sometimes terror, helplessness, and enchantment to our imaginations, showing us glimpses of the terrible and sublime in Hindu mythology. Why and how mankind peoples the unseen dimensions which surround them on every side. 12. Western religions. The major monotheistic religions of Western civilization, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all claim roots in Middle Eastern religious developments. Judaism envisions itself as centered on a covenant between God and a chosen people rather than a prophet or savior, though it helped give rise to the other two largest faiths. Christianity and Islam accept earlier prophets but see their own founders, Jesus and Muhammad respectively, as the prophets who most fully revealed God's will. 13. Eastern religions. 5 centuries before the birth of Christ, Buddhism originated in India, though its most powerful influence was in China and the Far East. The supreme goal of its founder, the Buddha, or Enlightened One, was nirvana, or liberation from the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Hinduism, a polytheistic religion, but also in a sense monotheistic, for the many gods are only manifestations of an immanent, unifying principle, which is regarded as an impassive absolute, but may also appear as a personal god without a founder, but with a body of sacred literature, the Veda. Hinduism is remarkable for its toleration of other faiths. 14. Ancient myths and legends. Wherever cultures have grown, there are common universal themes running through their religions and mythologies. The myths and legends of the ancient world make a wonderful, colorful tapestry expressing the variety of local experiences and attitudes. The gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, Romans, Aztecs, and Mayas, Northern Europeans, and Celts reflect man's desire to explain the nature of the universe and the human psyche, the mysteries of birth and death, the progression of the seasons, and the riddle of creation. 15. Folklore, primitive beliefs and customs. Early anthropologists assumed that the beliefs and ritual practices of the so-called primitive peoples represented the earliest forms of religion. When magic did not work, man resorted to prayer and sacrifice. Others are interested in the social significance or in the psychological interpretation of these beliefs. Whatever their significance, primitive beliefs and customs are still very much alive in many parts of the world. 16. Psychology and the paranormal. As interest in the paranormal has grown, a number of psychical researchers have been investigating ways in which modern techniques can explore this area. Statistics and laboratory neutrality have been employed to examine such disparate experiences as ESP, extrasensory perception, trance states, mediumistic powers, dreams, psychokinesis, and faith healing. Research into the recesses of the mind is also the province of psychoanalysis, theories of the unconscious. Research into mesmerism and hypnotism, as well as acupuncture and homeopathy, are attempts to understand the link between the mind and the body and its relevance for healing. 17. The soul. Where do we come from, and where are we going? The central issues concerning the meaning of our existence on Earth always raise questions about the possibility of an afterlife. As human beings, we are uniquely endowed with the quality of consciousness. Do we have a soul, a spirit? Can this part of the self survive the body's death? If so, to what purpose? Are we reincarnated, as so many people firmly believe? Every religion and mythology tries to explore these questions in some form or another. 18. Ghosts, vampires, and hauntings. Who has not shivered at the thought of being alone in a graveyard or haunted house at midnight? The continued popularity of ghost stories perhaps answers a basic need to believe in survival after death. Ancestor worship involved the need to propitiate the dead, and in all societies, man has feared their return. Various theories have been put forward to explain why ghosts return. Do they return to seek vengeance, or for some other evil purpose? Do they seek proper burial, or return to complete some task left undone in their lifetime? Or do people who see ghosts experience only a temporary derangement of the senses? Societies for psychical research try to take a scientific view of ghosts. 19. Mystics, all at once, as it were out of the intensity of the consciousness of individuality, individuality itself seemed to dissolve and fade away into boundless being. Tennyson. Mystics, explorers of untrodden paths, often employ unusual techniques to apprehend spiritual truths that are inaccessible to the understanding. Despite differences between the Eastern and Western traditions, they all seek a direct unity with eternity, whether seen in terms of a personal God or as a state of consciousness. 20. Unorthodox Christians. Thousands of people all over the world express their spiritual needs outside mainstream Christianity. In the Middle Ages, heretics were persecuted by the Inquisition, but compulsion only made men into hypocrites or martyrs. Audacious pioneers of unorthodox beliefs have tried to reinterpret Christianity in the light of new scientific developments, or to make sense of social upheavals in the accepted order. Revivalism, messianic millenarian sects, speaking in tongues, and faith healing are all areas where Christians have explored outside tradition, creeds, and observances. 21. Occultists and theosophists, charlatans and scoundrels, or guardians of an arcane wisdom, their lore is veiled in secrecy, shrouded in mystery, known only to the initiated few. Occultists, Rosicrucians, magicians, and that most popular of present-day secret societies, the Freemasons, practice rituals, including secret signs and words. Theories of the occult and the Kabbalah try to explain the structure of the universe, the macrocosm and the microcosm, the tree of life, and the system of correspondences which unites all creation. Though they claim, along with theosophists, to be outside or to embrace all religions, they believe in a spiritual background to existence. Aberdeen Witches. In the archives of the city of Aberdeen is a remarkable collection of documents, records of the Dean of Guild, 1596-1597, that provide details of the proceedings against many individuals accused of the detestable practice of witchcraft and sorcery. Marginal notes indicate that these documents were used in court, with most of them consisting of ditties or charges against the accused. The gathering of evidence against those suspected of witchcraft and sorcery was conducted by the ministers and elders of the Reformed Church in various parishes. Unfortunately, suspects could be named by anyone, a feature that allowed for malicious accusations, and many harmless elderly people were falsely accused. Suspects were summoned before the Kirk sessions for examination, and those considered guilty were sent to Aberdeen assizes. Even when considering the ignorance and superstition of the time, it is challenging to excuse the ministers of the gospel, educated individuals, whose testimony led to the execution of many innocent people. However, some of the evidence suggests the existence of a definite organization practicing the dark arts in northeast Scotland, the group known to history as the Aberdeen Witches. The main points that can be established about the group are: first, the practice of the dark arts as a confidential cult, almost clandestine, with its secrets passed down from generation to generation. Secondly, it was widespread, and although each of its members acted individually in their respective localities, they were required to attend general meetings and participate in the ceremonies and rituals involved in working woe, causing harm. The witches were organized into covens, typically consisting of groups of 13 individuals. During the general meetings, it was believed that the devil himself presided over the gatherings, often taking the form of a great grey stag, boar, or dog. Presumably, the devil was a man dressed as an animal. These meetings reportedly involved dancing and sexual relations with the devil, who was known as Christ Sondav, as well as with a woman referred to as the Queen of Elfin, Queen of the Elves. The Queen was described as having the ability to appear old or young at her discretion, and she had the power to make anyone she chose king, and to have relations with anyone she desired. Accusations were made that the witches saluted the devil and the queen by kissing them on the buttocks. There appeared to be no age restriction for entry into the coven, as many of those accused attested to being introduced as young children. Each member of a coven specialized in some particular form of sorcery, covering a wide range. Isoliel Cocky bewitched mills and livestock, while Margaret Ogg devoted her attention to butchering meat with dire results. Helen Rogie brought illness and death by modelling figures of her victims in lead or wax. And Isabel Strachan was notorious as a fascinator of nice young men. Isabel Ritchie had a special line in confectionery for expectant mothers, while Isabel Ogg's forte was the raising of storms. It would seem that the witches had one common faculty, that of causing the sudden sickness, whereby their victims would spend half of the day roasting as if in an oven, with an unquenchable thirst, and the other half of the day melting away with an extraordinary cold sweat. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in the Aberdeen Assizes came when Andrew Mann turned King's evidence against his colleagues, a witch from boyhood and the father of several children by the Queen of Elphin. He convinced the court that, with his long and extensive experience, he was in the unique position of being able to identify any witch or warlock brought before him. Accordingly, he was appointed the official witch-finder to the assizes, and with a 3-inch needle pricked the suspects' bodies for the devil's mark, a spot insensible to pain and believed to be inflicted by the devil. While awaiting trial, the subjects were confined either in the cells of the toll booth or in Our Lady's Pity Vault, for the Reformation had brought degradation to this place of worship. A number of the accused took their own lives in prison, and their bodies were thrown outside to be dragged through the streets until their battered, shapeless carcasses were unrecognizable. When the assizes closed in April, 24 people, 23 women and 1 man, had been found guilty of witchcraft. All were condemned to death, to be taken out between the hills, bound to a stake, strangled by the executioner, and their bodies burnt to ashes. The few whose guilt was not proven were ordered to be branded on the cheek and banished. The final tragic scene took place between the hills, in the grassy hollow lying between Aberdeen's Castle Hill and the neighbouring Heading Hill, the depression now covered by Commerce Street, and the black reek and stench from the burnings hung over the burg for many weeks. At one stage in the assizes, it appeared that the number of executions would increase, and the Dean of Guild, fearing rising costs might prejudice the burnings, took it upon himself to lay in a supply of coal to the value of £29.04. His foresight paid dividends, as shown by the final entry in the records dated 21st September 1597, which states that the Provost, Bailies, and Council, considering the faithfulness shown by William Dunn, the Dean of Guild, in the discharge of his duty, and besides this, his extraordinary taking pains on the great number of witches burnt this year, and to encourage others to work as diligently in the discharge of their office, grant and assign to him the sum of £47 3s and 4d. Before the end of the year, and while the subject of witchcraft and sorcery was still in people's minds, King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, published his book Demonology in defence of witch hunting. It proved to be a bestseller. Fenton Wine's Abominable Snowman. The abominable snowman of the Himalayas is supposed to be a creature, part human and part animal, measuring about the size of a 12 or 14-year-old child. It walks upright on 2 legs, swinging its arms. Descriptions mention its hair as reddish or light brown, not very thick. European travellers referred to the snowman as abominable because of the fear with which the Sherpas, a Himalayan people, regard these creatures, which they call Yeti. Numerous expeditions have searched for the Yeti, but they have been unsuccessful. Mountaineers have come across footprints in the snow believed to be made by the Yeti, but research has shown that these tracks were left by other animals. Anthropologists have raised doubts about the Sherpas' stories, and the prevailing view is that the snowman is a legend. Similar tales of hairy mountain men have also been reported from the Gobi Desert, Mongolia, and the Rockies near Canada's Pacific coast. According to Sherpa folklore, a monkey king embraced Buddhism and lived as a hermit in the mountains. An ogress fell in love with him, and he abandoned his solitary life to marry her. The children they had were covered in hair and had tails, and they were the first Yeti. A Tibetan is shown holding a cap purportedly made from a Yeti's scalp, but it has been revealed that these caps are actually made from deer hide. Abracadabra. The word abracadabra has been so widely used in magic that it has become part of the patter of stage conjurers and is even listed in dictionaries as a term for magical nonsense words in general. Daniel Defoe, in his Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, mentioned that many people who were terrified of the plague acted as if it were an evil spirit threatening to take possession of their bodies. They attempted to ward it off with specific words or figures, especially the word abracadabra formed in a triangle or pyramid. Another possibility is that abracadabra is connected with Abraxas, a god who appears on magical charms, gems, and rings used to ward off evil from the 2nd century AD onwards. Abraxas originated with the followers of an eccentric Christian thinker named Basilides, who taught at Alexandria about 120 to 140. One of his theories was that Jesus had not really been crucified. The followers of Basilides seem to have constructed the name Abraxas for the god who ruled each year and its 365 days. The letters of the Greek alphabet also stood for numbers, and the Greek letters of Abraxas add up to 365. Below this god were 365 orders of spirits, occupying 365 heavens, the lowest of which was the domain of the spirits who rule the earth. The 7 letters of Abraxas may stand for the 7 planets known in antiquity, believed in astrology to control the workings of fate. The central character of Homer's Iliad was honored as a semi-divine being, and his influence on Western ideas of the hero has lasted to the present day. Achilles. The plot of the Iliad, one of the most blood-drenched stories ever told, centers around the pride and ungovernable temper of Achilles, Achilles in Greek, the most formidable of the Greek champions who laid siege to Troy. The wrath of Achilles is my theme, Homer begins. That fatal wrath which sent the gallant souls of many noble men to Hades, leaving their bodies as carrion for the dogs and passing birds. The Iliad is usually dated to the 8th century BC. It is quite possible that Achilles was originally a real man, no matter how legendary the exploits with which Homer and later authors credited him. Homer calls him the great runner for his skill as an athlete, and the city sacker for his prowess as a fighter. In Hesiod, who wrote some years after Homer, he is lion-hearted Achilles, the destroyer of men. Later still, as a result of the fame which the Iliad brought him, he was honored in many parts of the Greek world as a hero, a being halfway between a god and a man. At the village of Achilleum near Troy, there was a temple sacred to Achilles and a statue of the hero, wearing, oddly enough, a woman's earring. At Elis on the Greek mainland, he had a monument, and on a certain day, towards sunset, the women of Elis honored him by lamenting his death. He had a temple and a statue on Lus, the white island in the Black Sea opposite the mouths of the Danube, where offerings were made to him and games were held in his honor. It was said that passing sailors heard his voice across the water, reciting Homer to the accompaniment of the clash of battle and the thunder of horses' hooves, the wrath of Achilles. The story of the Iliad begins in the 10th year of the siege of Troy, when the Greek supreme commander, Agamemnon, seized a beautiful slave girl who had been allotted to Achilles as a prize of battle. Insulted, Achilles refused to fight anymore, and his absence gravely weakened the Greek resistance to fierce Trojan attacks. Agamemnon tried to make amends, offering to return the girl to Achilles with many splendid gifts, but Achilles was still nursing his fury and refused to be reconciled. Lacking Achilles, the situation of the Greeks became so dangerous that Patroclus, the dearly loved friend of Achilles, went out to fight the Trojans. Patroclus was killed by the best of the Trojan warriors, Hector. When this news was brought to him, Achilles became berserk with grief and rage, and readied himself for battle, despite the warning from his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, that he was doomed to die after Hector's death. The next day, bearing new arms given to him by the gods, Achilles chased his victims with the fury of a fiend, and the earth was dark with blood. His horses trampled over dead men and fallen shields as he raged on in search of glory until he found Hector and killed him in single combat. Gloating over the Trojans' death agony, Achilles maltreated Hector's corpse, dragging it in the dust behind his chariot, and he intended to throw it to the dogs to gnaw. But Hector's father persuaded him to return the body to the Trojans so that it could be decently buried. The Iliad ends with the funeral rites for Hector, but it is clear that Achilles has not long to live, and that he will be killed by Hector's brother Paris and the archer god Apollo. The Odyssey describes his death in battle, with the flower of the Greek and Trojan warriors falling around him in the struggle over his corpse. The sea nymphs came from the ocean to weep salt tears for him, and the 9 muses sang his dirge. His bones were mingled with those of his friend Patroclus and buried outside Troy. Something superhuman. Achilles possesses all the virtues of the Homeric hero. He is brave, passionate, ferocious in battle, beautiful to look at, intensely proud, and fated to an early death. His failing is his uncontrollable anger. His treatment of Hector's corpse is so savage that Homer calls it shameful outrage, and condemns his slaughter of a dozen Trojan prisoners at the funeral of Patroclus as an evil thing. Many of the best-known stories about Achilles appear in later writers, including some which have parallels in folk tales all over the world, like the story that his mother tried to make him immortal by dipping him into a fire, but her husband thought she was trying to kill the child and stopped her. A famous variant of this is that she dipped him in the Styx, the river of the underworld, which made all of him death. Achilles was only a boy when the Greek armies gathered for the siege of Troy. His mother hid him on the island of Scyros, where he was dressed as a girl and brought up with the king's daughters. But the crafty Odysseus came to Scyros, bringing presents of cloth for dressmaking, a spear, and a shield. Achilles revealed himself by ignoring the cloth and seizing the weapons. What name Achilles bore when hidden among the women is an old problem. One suggestion is that he was called Pyrrha, meaning redhead, due to the color of his hair. At Troy, after the death of Hector, Achilles is said to have defeated various other notable fighters, including Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, a tribe of warrior women who had come to fight on the Trojan side. When he had killed her with a spear thrust, he was so smitten by her beauty that he made love to her dead body. Some said that Achilles and Patroclus were homosexual lovers. There is no such suggestion in Homer, but the accusation was made against many famous figures. Most of these later stories tend to lessen the stature of the hero as compared with the picture of him in Homer. However, there is a suitably grim tale in the Hecuba of Euripides. After the fall of Troy, the ghost of Achilles rose in the sheer of golden armor and stood high on the crest of his tomb, demanding its share of the spoil in the shape of Polyxena, the daughter of the king of Troy. The Greeks slaughtered the girl on Achilles' grave mound so that she could accompany her new master to the afterworld, and the blood welled from her neck over her golden robes. Acorn. As the fruit of the oak tree, which is sacred to many cultures, the acorn has found a place in a good deal of magical lore. It has been a fertility symbol, along with other seeds, nuts, and fruits. Although acorns imply a special kind of long-lasting fertility, it has been widely used as a good luck charm, and even today, replicas are found with other talismanic or charm bracelets. In a European form of marriage divination, a young girl might take 2 acorns, name one of them for herself, and the other for her lover, and drop them into a basin of water. If they floated together, it was considered a sign of a happy marriage. Otherwise, the omen was considered bad. A traditional British belief suggests that carrying acorns preserves youthfulness. In the southern USA, acorns entered into folk medicine as a cure for rheumatism. The ancient Celtic Druids, who venerated the oak, ate acorns as part of their ritual preparation for foretelling the future. In Scandinavian mythology, the oak was sacred to the thunder god Thor, and acorns would be placed in windows to appease the god and protect the house against lightning. Some aspects of this practice persisted into more recent times. For example, roller window blinds often had tassels shaped like acorns. The acorn plays a central role in the religion of many California Indian tribes. For them, acorns were a staple food, vital to their well-being, similar to how maize was to tribes east of the mountains. Tales about acorns abound in the mythology of tribes like the Luiseno. Other tribes, such as the Hoopa and Yuki, held a great annual acorn feast as the central feature of their harvest celebrations. During this ritual, acorns were ceremonially cooked and eaten, while prayers were made to the god of vegetation to protect the stored crop and ensure future harvests. Acupuncture. Acupuncture is a system of healing that is centuries old in China, still in use there, taught in medical schools, and has been practiced in the West since the 1930s. In acupuncture, thin needles are inserted into the skin to a depth of about 1/10 of an inch. They are left in place for a few minutes and then removed. To the casual observer, it might appear as though very little has been done, but in the right circumstances, acupuncture can have a profound and seemingly magical effect on a patient's health. One aspect that contributes to the sense of magic in acupuncture is that needles are often inserted at points that seem unrelated to the ailment being treated. For example, inserting a needle into the little toe can be used to cure a headache, or treating liver conditions might involve inserting a needle into the patient's shoulder. This unconventional approach can make acupuncture seem almost mystical. While acupuncture is sometimes effective, no conclusive scientific explanation has been provided for its mechanisms. Philosophically, acupuncture is based on theories about forces that govern everything in the universe, including human health. Medically, it is based on the observation that certain points on the body's surface become tender as a result of illness, and pressing on these tender points can alleviate pain. The Chinese identified around 1,000 points on the skin where stimulation can relieve or cure disease. These points are divided into 12 systems, and each system has meridians, which are invisible lines connecting points associated with a particular organ in the body. Each of these meridians corresponds to a major organ, such as the heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, and bladder. For example, the meridian of the liver runs from the area near the liver to the inside of the leg and down to the big toe. The heart meridian runs from the heart down the inside of the arm to the little finger. Each point has a specific name and is associated with certain medical conditions. For instance, there are points linked to bronchitis, asthma, and rheumatism, among other conditions. Some acupuncture points correspond to vital spots used in martial arts like judo and karate, and some are related to yoga practices. For example, yogis stimulate a point in the armpit to enhance breathing during long walks. This point is located on the lung meridian of acupuncture. Despite the mystery surrounding acupuncture, it has been practiced for centuries and remains an integral part of traditional Chinese medicine. The flow of qi acupuncture is extremely ancient, and the oldest book on the subject, the Neijing, Book of the Yellow Emperor, dates from 200 BC, but contains material which is much older. It has been suggested that the system developed when people notice that a warrior slightly wounded in battle by a blow from a stone or a sharp weapon might be cured of some ailment by the wound. Acupuncture depends on the belief that in the healthy human body there is a continuous circulation of vital energy or life force. This energy is called qi in Chinese, which basically means air or breath. The identification of the life force with air, based on the simple observation that you cannot live without breathing, is found all over the world. Qi circulates through the 12 meridians starting from the lungs, which draw breath once every 24 hours. If it fails to flow properly, the organs of the body will suffer from a deficiency of energy, or, where it is blocked, from a surplus of it. Acupuncture tries to bring the flow of life force back to normal by sedating a meridian which has too much qi, or tonifying a meridian which has too little. If a meridian is empty, deficient in qi, the previous meridian is tonified, and qi flows from the lungs through the large intestine, the stomach, the spleen, and the heart to the liver. If the spleen is empty, the stomach meridian is tonified, and the energy then flows on from it to the spleen. A secondary result is that because the stomach is now full of energy, the flow from the large intestine meridian is dammed back, so there is an increase of energy in the large intestine. Although taking the pulse is the main method of diagnosis in acupuncture, there are other signals that give the acupuncturist clues to your physical condition. If you have a soft voice with a clear tone, this suggests that you have a satisfactory flow of qi. A strong, rough voice suggests that you have too much qi flow, an excess of vital energy. A weak voice, lacking in resonance, suggests a weak and unstable flow of qi. Similarly, a pure and unblemished skin with a rosy tint points to a healthy flow of qi, a congested and reddish skin to too much qi, and a thick fatty skin with a greyish or pale colour to too little. Interplay of yang and yin qi is the product of two great forces, principles, or polarities called yang and yin. These forces run through the whole universe, and everything that exists depends on the interplay between them. Life, as Felix Mann puts it, exists as the result of tension between two extremes, and their different forms of combination with each other produce the 5 basic elements of which everything is made: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. If they are thought of in terms of electricity, yang is the positive charge, and yin is the negative. If in terms of sex, yang is male, and yin is female. The sun, light, strength, the right side, fire, dryness, and many other qualities belong to yang. Their opposites, the moon, darkness, weakness, the left side, water, and wetness, belong to yin. It has been suggested that the system developed when people noticed that a warrior slightly wounded in battle by a blow from a stone or a sharp weapon might be cured of some ailment by the wound. Acupuncture depends on the belief that in the healthy human body there is a continuous circulation of vital energy or life force. The organs and meridians of the body are classified in terms of yang and yin. The heart, lungs, spleen, kidneys, and liver belong to yin, and a patient who has a weak heart will be said to be suffering from a deficiency of yin. The intestines, stomach, bladder, and gallbladder belong to yang. Health and a satisfactory flow of qi depend on a perfect balance between yang and yin in the body. When the yang and yin energies in a person's body are reasonably in balance, they are healthy. If one becomes too strong or too weak, they become ill. If the yang and yin energies become separated altogether, the person is dead. The acupuncturist stimulates the appropriate points on the skin with needles, either to restore the flow of the weakened energy or to restrict the flow of the stronger energy, and so bring the two energies back into balance. For a similar idea in the West, it is said that seasonal changes affect the flow of energy. Yang is more active than yin in spring and summer, and the reverse is the case in autumn and winter. The yin energy is stronger than the yang at the time of the new moon. The theory of yang and yin was systematized by a philosopher named Zhu Yan in the 4th century BC, but the belief that all things are made of opposites is not by any means confined to China. Early Greek thinkers saw that the universe can be described in terms of opposites. Day gives way to night, summer to winter, heat to cold, youth to age. They also developed the theory that everything is made of 4 basic materials, or elements, each combining 2 of the primary qualities, which are 2 pairs of opposites, hot and cold, dry and wet. The theory of the 4 elements and qualities was scarcely challenged until the 17th century. The idea that the world is made of opposites, with the consequent necessity for balancing and reconciling them harmoniously with each other, like yang and yin in the healthy body, was a basic doctrine of alchemy, also appears in astrology, and has remained one of the fundamental theories of occultism in the West. Adonis. That the name Adonis is still a byword for masculine beauty is a legacy from Greek mythology. In the myth, Aphrodite, the alluring goddess of love, falls irresistibly in love with the handsome young Adonis, but there is tragedy in store. He is out hunting one day when he is gored and killed by a boar, sent by Ares, Aphrodite's jealous husband. According to various versions of the myth, the rose springs from the young god's dying blood, or the anemone springs up from the tears Aphrodite sheds for him, or all roses were white originally, but Aphrodite pricks herself on a thorn as she runs to help her lover, and her blood falls on the roses and stains them red. Behind this poetic tale lies the ancient theme of the mother goddess and her virile lover, the dying god who represents the vegetation that dies with every autumn and comes back to life with every spring. The Greek version tells only of the death of the god, but Adonis, whose name means Lord, was originally a similar figure to Tammuz in Mesopotamia, the lover of the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, who rescued him from the realm of death and restored him to life. In another Greek story, which preserves more of the dying and rising theme, Adonis is the son of a king in Cyprus, or Assyria, by incest with his daughter, Myrrha. The gods turn Myrrha into a tree, the myrrh, and in due time a beautiful boy is born of the tree. Aphrodite entrusts him to Persephone, the queen of the underworld, to look after, but she is so taken with his extraordinary beauty that she refuses to let him go. Eventually, Zeus decides that the youthful god is to spend part of the year below ground with Persephone, part with Aphrodite, and part on Olympus. This tale is obviously linked with the death and rebirth of crops and vegetation, and recalls the myth of the rape of Persephone herself. Africa. You are useless, you gods. Africa is a land of many gods, indigenous, Christian, and Islamic, of spirits, magic, witchcraft, and prophecy. The continent of Africa contains maybe as many as 6,000 different groups of people. So complex and variable are African languages, cultures, and religions that anthropologists cannot yet agree on what sorts of generalizations can be made about the peoples of this area. It follows that where there are so many different sorts of peoples, there are many gods and concepts of God, and many religious sects with their own particular rituals, magical practices, and traditional myths. Some idea of the enormous diversity involved can be gained by contrasting Egyptian Copts, who maintain an ancient form of Christianity, with Zimbabwean spirit mediums who work together with the Zanla guerrillas in helping to organize peasants in the anti-colonialist struggle against their white overlords. Both Copts and spirit mediums are Africans, and both are archetypical in their own ways of African cultural groups and religious beliefs. But it seems that, while admitting to the existence of fantastic diversity, there are certain basic concepts that appear to underlie a great number of African religions. These concepts far from being the mumbo-jumbo that most narrow-minded Europeans used to consider them to be, have their own logic and remain today, in many parts of the continent, a powerful spiritual and social force. It is important to remember, though, that, as in many religions around the globe, many African faiths are more concerned with the problems of the individual in this world than with elaborating a highly systematic and logically coherent set of beliefs. Rather than ponder the nature of God, many people are more interested in the efficacy of their rituals and their ability to alleviate suffering. They want to know how their ancestors may assist them, rather than trouble themselves about the status of a distant divinity. There are over 70 million Christians in Africa. Traditional beliefs, gods of nature. To many Africans who still hold to their traditional beliefs, there are over 200 principal epithets ranging from the everlasting one of the forest to he who roars so loud that the nations are struck with terror is an ever-present being, and his priests, who used to be dismissed as medicine men or witch doctors by foreigners, are usually recognized leaders of their communities. Estimates give the number of non-Christians and non-Muslims in the continent as over 180 million, or more than half the total population. In earlier times, before Europeans gained a better idea of the real character of African traditional beliefs, these people were simply called heathens. They were seen as poor benighted savages who bowed down to wood and stone. Then, Europeans came to call them pagans, from the Latin paganus, which originally meant a peasant or countryman. But this replacement term is still too pejorative, and it is best to call those who have not converted to or been brought up in either Christianity or Islam holders of traditional, indigenous, or autochthonous beliefs. Most upholders of traditional practices believe in a polytheistic system in which a chief god presides over lesser deities, rather as a king ruled over his domain in ancient times. Most indigenous African religions have their supreme being called by 100 different names which vary from group to group, but no matter what the chief god is called, he is usually conceived of as the maker of the world, the master of human destiny, an omnipotent and omnipresent, King of kings and Lord of lords, and under the rule of the supreme being are all the lesser godlings, each with his or her special function. One question which has long puzzled many European visitors is whether this supreme being, whatever his name, is an abstract idea, a sort of creative energy which animates and pervades the universe, but has no direct relationship with humans, or whether this God is a personal being, like the Jehovah of the Hebrews, or the Our Father of the Christians, though it is difficult to generalize about the nature of supreme beings in Africa, and even more difficult to understand satisfactorily these religious concepts and to translate them adequately in European languages. It does appear to be the case that an idea of some kind of supreme being is universal among those peoples of the continent still maintaining their traditional beliefs. It is also the case that, to many European observers who frequently have their own peculiar ideas about religion, worship of this supreme being often appears to be something of an almost lackadaisical affair. To these foreigners, brought up in a different cultural milieu, it often seems strange that the creator of the universe is regarded as somewhat indifferent to mere humans and their problems. On the other hand, the lesser gods, the spirits of the earth, and the ghosts of departed heroes are usually thought to be much more sympathetic to the lot of humans. They can be flattered, wheedled, and even threatened. One African religious entreaty, which is not particularly unusual, states, in Bowdlerized form, "You are useless, you gods. You give us only trouble. You are a bunch of so-and-sos. What do we get from you? Nothing." Of course, this quasi-personal relationship with their divinities is not peculiar to upholders of African traditional beliefs. Roman Catholics also usually approach God via the intermediaries of the Virgin Mary, or the communion of saints, whether the apostles, disciples, martyrs, or past members of the believer's local community who have been beatified and sanctified. Similarly, in Islam, Muhammad and his fellow prophets, who include Jesus, are the intermediaries between humble humans and Almighty God. Appreciation of the importance of nature is one of the more significant aspects of traditional African belief systems, and it is found in over 100 different forms throughout the continent. We are familiar with the animal gods of ancient Egypt. Among those divinities, the crocodile and serpent were accorded special veneration, and they still are in some parts of Africa. Unlike most Europeans, who regard all snakes, whether poisonous or not, as repellent and to be exterminated, many Africans upholding their autochthonous religions are much more discriminating. Instead of killing snakes, they try to placate the snake spirit itself. For instance, members of several East and West African peoples strive to ensure, by their practices, that the python spirit is not disturbed or given reason to act. In the mid-19th century, European travelers described the python temples where specimens of these snakes were fed, watered, venerated, and danced to. The python god was given many wives who brought him food and water and made him comfortable with grass mats and a decorated house. In return for these labors, his spirit watched over the group and, via his intermediary, the local priest who consulted his omens, forewarned the community of dangers, accidents, and the like. The penalty for killing a python was death by burning. In 1864, the explorer Sir Richard Burton saw a python slayer burnt alive in his hut, from which he escaped only to be clubbed to death by priests. Another significant aspect of traditional African religious systems is the common belief in some sort of life after death. In any case, in these communities of co-believers, no one is thought to die from natural causes. A person does not die naturally. He or she ceases to live because they have been interfered with in some way, perhaps by human enemies, perhaps by evil spirits. Hence, when a person passes over, this does not mean that he or she has gone for good, but, on the contrary, is believed to continue to take part in the communal life, now in his or her spirit form. It would be incorrect to say, however, that followers of most traditional African religions worship these ancestor spirits. Rather, they consult them, ask them for favors, or even argue with them. The ghosts of the deceased are frequently thought to be in some way present in a peculiarly personal belonging or frequented place, their hut, or the log they used to sit on in council meetings, or the tree beneath which they rested. Moreover, while Europeans' ideas of personal life after death are often comparatively vague, a good number of traditionally minded Africans believe in some form of reincarnation, whereby it is thought that one of the ancestors can return from the spirit world to become an occasional part of the body of a newly born child. Attempting to summarize the main tenets of African indigenous religions as far as possible given their variety, we can tentatively state that there appears to be a common underlying belief in a supreme being who made the world and who presides over the destiny of humankind, that this world is peopled both by living humans, by spirits who are enshrined in natural phenomena, and by dead ancestors, that there is no final death but an active afterlife frequently coupled with an eventual return to earth. The coming of Islam. Muslims make up the second largest religious group in Africa. Their number is estimated at over 100,000, the majority in North Africa, which is almost totally Islamic. The Arabs began their remarkably rapid conquest of Africa in the 7th century and had wiped out almost all ostensible traces of Christianity within 100 years. Only the Coptic churches of Egypt and Ethiopia survived. Small communities of Christians who were to be effectively cut off from their brethren in the outside world for almost 10 centuries. Once the people of North Africa had been converted by the evangelizing armies, Arab traders and merchants began to penetrate regions which even the Carthaginians and Romans had not explored systematically. At the same time, as they hunted for sources of ivory, gold, and slaves, they took with them, into places it had never been carried before, their new religion, an uncompromising faith fervently propounded, which left subject peoples with little alternative. One was either a believer or an infidel. In practical terms, this often meant a choice of life or death. Millions of followers of traditional religions over large stretches of the continent chose to cooperate with the determined and well-armed invaders, just as they were to cooperate with the Portuguese Christians during the 17th and 18th centuries. In some senses, conversion to Islam did not necessitate too fundamental a change in local ways of life. The Muslim concept of the one God dovetailed, to a certain extent, with locals' pre-existent beliefs in a supreme being. Moreover, Quranic law, as opposed to Christian morality, did not conflict with certain aspects of indigenous custom. For instance, it recognized the institution of slavery, which, as far as is known, was a long-established, integral component of many of these traditional societies. However, Muslims adapted its rules somewhat by regulating the treatment of slaves, concubinage, the status of the resulting children, and the rights of slaves as human beings, particularly if they chose to convert to the new religion. It is not difficult to imagine that those Africans who had suffered from cruel kings and chiefs might have welcomed the new laws. Before the arrival of the Arabs, some local groups treated captives from rival groups as lifelong serfs, or, in some cases, put them to death. Once the new Islamic lords of the land had established their dominion, they introduced a more humane relationship between masters and their slaves. These invaders also brought with them many new arts and crafts which they taught to their converts. The results of this progressive mass conversion, which continues to this day, albeit usually in a much milder form, are obvious throughout Muslim Africa today. Islam is a living, powerful force, one frequently with strong political overtones. Once converted to the faith, it is rare for locals to become apostates to Christianity, and most missionaries now openly admit that it is a waste of time to try to proselytize in predominantly Muslim countries such as Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Mauritania. Wherever Islam has been established for a few centuries, it gives the impression of having become a wholly integral part of the spiritual, social, and political life of its African converts and their descendants. Christianity returns. From about 100 to 600 AU, the Christian church in Africa was one of the great bulwarks of the faith, a church with millions of adherents, hundreds of bishops, and a long list of martyrs and leaders. This seemingly powerful organization covered much of northern Africa, from the mountains of Ethiopia to the shores of the Atlantic, yet it was wiped out almost overnight, except for the Copts, by the conquest of the Arabs from the 7th century onwards. Non-Coptic Christianity was unable to obtain a new foothold on much of the African continent until almost 1,000 years later. Today, the Christian churches in Africa claim a total of over 70 million members, of whom more than 30,000 are Roman Catholics. Approximately 20,000 belong to the Coptic and Eastern churches, and the rest are Protestants. These figures, however, should be treated with great caution, as it is always difficult to take an exact census of how many people believe in which religion. The first Europeans to attempt systematically to explore and conquer parts of Africa beyond its northern shores were the Portuguese, who made their first voyages southwards during the mid-15th century. One of the objectives of these conquistadores was, in their own words, the exaltation of the Catholic faith. and priests invariably accompanied the armies and navies of these earliest invaders. They had considerable success in terms of numbers, for we hear of one Jesuit priest on a short tour through Zaire in 1531, who baptized 1,500 locals, using a hose for the purpose. Of course, whether he had explained satisfactorily the religious purpose of what he was doing is another matter. A number of local kings were also persuaded to divorce all their many wives save one, a change which no doubt had a great impact on the social, political, and economic organization of their realms. Unfortunately for the missionaries, however, and for many of the locals themselves, European slave traders were soon busy exporting millions of Africans overseas to the American continent. It is estimated that maybe as many as 100 million were shipped out as slaves between 1441, when the trade began with the arrival of the Portuguese, and 1888, when it was officially ended. Not surprisingly, some locals were puzzled by the contradiction of missionaries assuring them that they were the children of God, while fellow whites, avaricious traders in human flesh, were working hard to enslave as many as possible. This great problem was summed up by one Jesuit priest who worked in Zaire. Using the language and perpetuating the attitudes of his time, he wrote, "The Negro saw and compared with his rude intelligence the teachings and the works. They did not coincide. While the Christian missionaries proclaimed the lofty dignity of the child of God by grace, the Christian trader merely counted one more piece for his gang. Nevertheless, committed proselytizing Christians, such as Livingstone, continued with their work, and they have been followed by thousands of evangelists, an increasing number of them locals, who, in the last 100 or so years, have covered every part of the continent that they can. In the process, Christian doctrine and ritual have frequently been adapted to fit local contexts. In some cases, this has led to a considerable number of local Christians breaking away from the Orthodox European sects to establish churches of their own. There are now over 5,000 of these churches, whose membership of over 7 million is spread throughout much of the continent. Some of these churches are syncretic, openly combining elements of Christian and traditional religious beliefs and practices. The creation of these churches can also be seen as an effort by locals to reassert their religious autonomy and to come out from under the priestly tutelage of foreign missionaries. They are ways for locals to assert their Africanism in opposition to the European missionaries' white view of the world. The names of some of these new churches clearly indicate their desired independence from their Western counterparts. Thus, we have the Church of Jesus Christ on earth and its leader, the prophet Simon Kimbangu in Zaire, the Church of the Cherubim and Seraphim, and the Church of the Lord Aldura in Nigeria, and the Christian Marching Church of Central Africa, which is centered in Zimbabwe and see Messianic movements. Some of these churches were developed to meet the perceived needs of local Christians, which they felt were not being satisfied by the missions. For instance, the Aladura churches, studied by the British anthropologist Jeremy Eads, were created by Nigerian Yorubas because Orthodox Christianity, unlike traditional religions and the local form of Islam, did not offer healing techniques, protection against witches, and knowledge of the future. The faith of the missionaries seemed, in the eyes of some locals, to be more concerned with salvation in the next world than in solving their members' problems in this one. Thus, the leading protagonists of the Aladura churches are prophets who, unlike missionaries, act as charismatic healers and claim to be able to interpret dreams and visions. If one is to judge from the rituals of these autonomous churches, Christianity in much of Central and Southern Africa will soon have little resemblance to established religion as it is understood in the West. Ritual specialists. Until quite recently, ignorant Europeans used to portray indigenous ritual specialists as witch doctors, as bogeymen dressed in absurd masks, feathers, and animal skins, who would leap about wildly to the accompaniment of loud drum rhythms. They were alleged to deal in what was called pure mumbo-jumbo in order to hoodwink supposedly superstitious savages who were said to be under their spell. They were caricatured as traditional confidence tricksters who exploited their skills as performers to take advantage of their gullible audiences. This European stereotype of local ways is now recognized as a grave, self-interested misrepresentation that was used by whites to justify their colonization of Africans' lands, their labor power, and their souls. Many of those lampooned as witch doctors were, and are, in fact, indigenous medical practitioners, whose complex systems of curative knowledge are frequently based on different premises from that of scientific Western medicine. In some cases, these medical practitioners have developed cures that Western doctors would recognize as effective based on their knowledge of the drugs contained in certain plants. These indigenous practitioners have compiled an impressive pharmacopoeia for day-to-day needs, such as emetics to induce vomiting in the case of poison, purgatives for ridding children of worms, sedatives for quieting hysterics, and potions for chest colds, headaches, whooping cough, dysentery, snakebite, swellings, and stings. These practitioners also often deal with cases that Western doctors would find difficult to categorize and diagnose. For example, how would a British medical consultant deal with a person who, it was stated, was suffering from an attack by spirits? Some Western observers of the methods of indigenous practitioners argue that they sometimes rely on psychological techniques, but it is also recognized by most Western doctors that they too have very frequently to use somewhat similar methods, and their rate of successful cures is often less than that of indigenous African practitioners. Many followers of traditional beliefs would be ready to admit that Western medicines offer effective treatment for the curing of symptoms, but they would, at the same time, be quick to point out that these imported medicines are ineffective against the causes of the illness. If a person has fallen ill because they have been bewitched, a potion from a Western pharmaceutical company may resolve the outward manifestations of their ailment, but an indigenous practitioner would still need to be summoned to discover exactly who is bewitching the person. Once having ascertained the identity of the witch, they can then work to resolve the situation. Witchcraft has been grossly misunderstood by many Western observers. Far from being a strange collection of superstitious beliefs and practices, it is a logical mode of thought that serves the invaluable function of social control. For if, as is believed in many traditional religions, people may bewitch others without their being aware of doing so, then they must search their conscience when a practitioner accuses them of witchcraft, for possible reasons as to why they might have something against the stricken person. Given this system of belief, it is quite likely that those who transgress the norms of local society most frequently will be those most often accused of witchcraft. Thus, if a person wishes to avoid such accusations, it is best for them to uphold the group's values and to observe their rules to the full. Similarly, if a dispute between two persons remains unresolved, then, should one of the two fall ill, the other may well stand accused of causing the illness. So, it is best for all concerned that difficulties or important differences of opinion are settled to the satisfaction of the parties involved. These local practitioners are also often required to predict the future, which they do frequently, employing seemingly simple apparatus, such as placing a spider or crab in a container and divining the significance of the particular movements it makes. Their reputed ability to prophesy the future may be converted by some of them into political advantage. Among the Nuer of southern Sudan, prophets regularly arise, and the more successful of them act as conciliators and peacemakers. broadening and sustaining a moral community across ethnic and political divides. Medical practitioners in many groups may also be required to make special mixtures for their clients, for the purposes of warding off evil spirits or of giving a person protection from their enemies. The claims made for these mixtures seem directly comparable to those made in the West about substances such as royal jelly, said to prolong life, or guarana, which is sold as having aphrodisiacal powers. In some parts of Africa, men and women wear amulet pouches containing items such as antelope horns and animal teeth, because they believe it will protect them or act as a charm on members of the opposite sex. Once again, this sort of behavior is also found in the West. Many Catholics carry small crucifixes or religious medals to protect themselves against misfortune or accident. Indigenous rights. African upholders of traditional religions seldom erect large formal temples to their divinities. They tend to prefer natural or small shrines. These might contain a pool, prize stones, or a hut to house clay figures representing community gods and ancestors. To these shrines, people bring their offerings of, for example, eggs, cowrie shells, and pieces of cloth. People may also sacrifice their sheep, goats, or cattle in order to communicate with the divine. As in most world religions, believers in traditional African faiths mark, in a ritual manner, the birth of a new member of their community. Pregnant women must observe a number of special prohibitions, many related to their diet, to ensure that their pregnancy and subsequent delivery are trouble-free. In some areas, on the birth of a girl, the umbilical cord is cut with a hoe to ensure that she will be a good field worker. On the birth of a boy, the cord is cut with an arrow to ensure he will be a good hunter. Again, as in many parts of the world, marriage is regarded more as a social contract, bringing together a man and a woman from different families or lineages, than a religious occasion to be marked ceremonially. It is important, above all, that the marriage proves to be stable and, in some areas, is not regarded as finally established until the birth of the first child. In some communities, men are allowed to take more than one wife. Bringing more women into his homestead may increase the productive capacity of a man's domestic unit, but can also lead to problems of its own, as a husband must ensure that his wives get along with one another. Traditionally, among the Tiv of Nigeria, if the wives of a man knew that he was intending to take another wife, they would try to choose her for him, to forestall the possibility of his selecting an inappropriate woman, one whose character or style of work would cause dissension. Some African traditional religions do not make a sharp distinction between life and death. Death is seen as merely a change in status. The deceased remain a very real presence in the community, continuing to benefit the living by their wisdom and advice. Their souls return to that reservoir of power which we have called the Supreme Being. Their bodies pass as ghosts to that other world, which is common to many African traditional religions. According to the ideas of certain autochthonous religions, dead persons must, therefore, be provided for in death as in life. Hence, they are buried with solemn rites and interred with the necessities of existence, food, clothes, and cooking pots. In olden days, kings and chiefs were also buried with their wives and slaves, who were sacrificed for the occasion. Initiation ceremonies. The purpose of initiation rites is to promote unity, cooperation, and conformity to the life and law of the group, and to publicly mark the transition of the initiated from adolescence to adulthood. The most common form of these rites of passage, found in many parts of the continent, is circumcision. The initiation is typically overseen by village elders and conducted by a ritual specialist. The youths to be initiated are often sent away from the village into a special camp where they are not allowed to leave, possibly for as long as 6 months. During that time, they are considered to be on probation and may be subjected to certain ordeals. These ordeals can include being kept on a semi-starvation diet, being whipped for seemingly trivial offences, being crowded into pens, or being forbidden to wash until the ordeal is completed. Once circumcised, the boys may form blood brotherhood with each other. Those who successfully undergo the initiation emerge as full adult members of their group, with all the rights and privileges of the elders, including the right to marry. Some groups also practice a similar rite on girls, who are taken to a camp where they may undergo clitoridectomy. Undergoing this operation allows them to be regarded as adults and to be entitled to marry and bear children. Indigenous organized opposition to the continuation of this practice is growing. Secret societies. Membership of a secret society often begins at the very outset of the initiation rite mentioned above. From the moment the initiation returns from the initiation camp, they are often involved in various tasks and responsibilities for the society. These secret societies, which may have their roots in tribal and traditional beliefs, often deal with threats such as spirits, witches, and cannibalism. Members of these societies are believed to have supernatural powers and play a role in protecting the community from malevolent forces. One example is the leopard societies of West Africa, which are feared because they are believed to have the power to transform into leopards, the most dreaded animals of the forest. Like leopards, they are thought to claw their victims to death and consume parts of them. During colonial times, European administrators tried unsuccessfully to eradicate these leopard men. Perhaps the most widespread secret organizations are vigilante groups that engage in an ongoing battle against individuals who use supernatural means for evil purposes. For instance, in parts of Nigeria, there is a secret society whose members, identifiable by their tall conical headcloths that conceal their identities, descend on villages at night to root out and track down suspected evildoers. Many African governments recognize that they are unable to suppress these secret societies, even if they desired to do so. They understand that these societies are an integral part of social life and often wield significant political influence. Some politicians have even been known to exploit the fear and power of these societies for their own purposes. Good and bad magic. Some forms of magic are regarded as beneficent, others as maleficent. Beneficent magic is concerned with the problems of disease, both physical and mental, of accidents and misfortunes, and of natural disasters, such as drought. It is usually performed in the open, a public ceremony. Maleficent magic is reportedly performed privately at night. Some anthropologists have argued very convincingly that maleficent magic does not exist. What does exist are beliefs about the existence of this form of magic, and the perpetuation of these beliefs acts as a form of social control, keeping people in line. Beliefs in the existence of witchcraft rely on the perceived need to be able to explain the inexplicable and to explain it as the action of a person. Once that person has been identified, then efforts can be made to redress the situation. Europeans may regard a disastrous rainstorm at a critical stage of the agricultural cycle simply as something deeply unfortunate, over which they have no control. Believers in witchcraft, however, may regard that rain as the product of a particular person's acts, and so seek to resolve matters by counteracting their influence and by preventing them from continuing. Another example of the desire to explain what would seem to some as inexplicable might be the case of a granary hut collapsing on top of a man. It could be that the hut collapsed because termites had eaten through the pillar against which the man had been leaning. But that does not explain why it fell down at that particular time, or on that particular man. Secular whites might wish to call such an event an unfortunate incident or an unlucky coincidence. Believers in witchcraft see it as nothing of the sort. Among certain communities, it is believed that the majority of witches are men. In other communities, It is thought that the majority of them are women. In some groups, youthfulness is no protection against being accused of witchcraft, for in these communities it is thought that even the young may be witches. Beliefs about the supposed powers and practices of witches vary from group to group. In some groups, it is believed that witches practice their activities only at night, at which time they leave their bodies and fly off, sometimes as a ball of fire, sometimes as a night bird, to the tops of trees or a secret grove, where they convene with fellow witches and indulge in nocturnal orgies. These orgies are said to be cannibalistic. The witches feed on human flesh and are apparently especially partial to the tender meat of babies and young children. This supposed flesh-eating seems to be regarded by those who believe in its existence as a rite in which the soul of the victim is devoured, leading to the slow withering away of the victim's actual body. As one might imagine, even if these nocturnal flesh-eating feasts do not actually take place, belief in their occurrence is sufficient for them to be used as the explanation. Why, for instance, someone otherwise apparently healthy has suddenly fallen ill. Since ideas about witchcraft as a type of explanation form a logical and closed mode of thought which, once its premises have been accepted, cannot logically be disproved, it is not surprising that people's belief in its existence and its efficacy have survived. Indeed, belief in it is said to thrive among the relatively recently established African bourgeois of ex-colonial states. In other words, among the very class of people whom European administrators thought would be the first to give up such beliefs. It is mainly for these reasons that urbanization, Western education, and technological change have failed to alter the convictions of many about the persistence of witchcraft. Christian missionaries confess that these beliefs constitute the greatest obstacle to genuine conversion. It seems, perhaps, to be one that they will never overcome to their satisfaction. Underlying myths. Like almost all faiths, traditional African religions have their own collections of myths to explain the creation of the world and of humankind. Some, moreover, have myths similar to the Christian. Among some traditional African communities, the Supreme Being is said to have made man and woman from clay. These two mortals lived for a time in a paradisiacal state, from which they were expelled for committing something akin to the Christian notion of original sin. For example, one legend from one part of Nigeria blames the woman for having annoyed the Supreme Being by striking the sky with her pounding stick. Another, from a region in Zaire, says that her continued nagging became so intolerable that the Supreme Being lowered her down from heaven in a basket. Whatever the reason given by these myths for the expulsion from paradise, the consequence is usually the same. The original humans are alienated from their Creator, who henceforth retires into his own domain. There, in some of these myths, he grows older and, it seems, more maudlin. For according to some, his old eyes dribble with tears, which become the rain that falls upon the earth. According to others, he spends a great deal of time quarrelling with his wife. Claps of thunder are his shouting. African religions today. Despite the great variety of peoples living within this continent, it is true that religion in Africa, whether it be traditional, neo-traditional, syncretic, Islamic, or Christian, remains as vibrant and as socially important as ever. Established faiths may become unpopular. New churches arise. Novel forms of religiosity wax and wane, but religion, in general, retains its central position in the lives of the peoples who live there. Perhaps one generalization about Africa that can be made with any certainty is that there is widespread, though, unfortunately, not universal, tolerance of religious pluralism. Jeremy McClancy, Afro-American Law, The Horror and the Legacy. Africans shipped to the Americas aboard the slave vessels could bring nothing with them but their mental baggage. a store of pithy sayings, riddles, songs, legends, and beliefs about witches and evil spirits. The slaves were stowed aboard the slaver Brooks out of Liverpool in 1791. The Ku Klux Klan adopted their robes and spooky headgear to frighten blacks into believing that they were evil spirits. Dissolved in 1871, the Klan was revived by W.J. Simmons, who raised the first fiery cross outside Atlanta in 1916. The Africans who were transported to the Americas as slaves took their mental baggage across the Atlantic with them, just as all other groups of immigrants did. In the Africans' case, it was all they were allowed to take. Transplanted to the New World, African traditions blended with European folkways and beliefs to nurture a rich crop of Afro-American folklore. Afro-American law. The first African slaves in North America were landed in Virginia in 1619. The importation was stopped in 1808, and by the 1850s, the total slave population was about 4 million. Black culture in the United States was originally oral. Tales of the slavery time and of emancipation after the Civil War were passed on to subsequent generations by word of mouth. And, although these narratives might be based solidly on fact, they acquired a mythic quality over time as they were handed down the generations. Also handed down were pithy sayings, riddles, songs, beliefs about ghosts, witches, and evil spirits, and stories of mythical and legendary heroes told of an evening on the plantation after the day's work was done. Probably still the best known, in white circles, of the hero tales are the Uncle Remus stories retold by a white author, Joel Chandler Harris, 1843 to 1908. The first of them, Uncle Remus, His Songs and Sayings, came out in 1880. Harris grew up in Georgia, where he spent most of his life as a newspaperman, and the Uncle Remus stories made him famous throughout the English-speaking world. The central character of the tales is Brer Rabbit, an engaging trickster figure who owes something to the West African spider trickster Anansi. Stories of his exploits were told to white children in the South by their black nurses and servants. Running through them is the theme of the physically weak and defenseless rabbit, getting the better of the much bigger and stronger animals, whose natural prey he is, by his superior intelligence and craftiness. The theme has a strong appeal for children who find themselves weak and downtrodden in an adult world, but it had exactly the same attraction for blacks who found themselves weak and oppressed in the white world. The Terror. By night tales of ghosts and supernatural evil flourished among blacks, as they did among whites at similar social levels. People preferred not to walk near cemeteries at night, and strange things might be seen by moonlight. There were sinister ghosts called platees, the spirits of men untimely murdered, feared by animals and human beings alike. There is a story about a woman on a plantation sending her 2 small sons with a mule to fetch the week's supplies from the store. They collected the groceries and returned home, the mule walking through dense, scary woods as the moon showed eerily in the sky. Then the mule became uneasy, and, when they came to a spot where a man had been mysteriously killed years before, he put his ears back and stood stock still. They whacked him with a stick, but he would not go on. Then they felt a gust of warm air, and a little white cloud crossed the road in front of them. It smelled of sulphur. The mule reared back, and the boys and the groceries fell off his back. They did not try to pick them up, but jumped onto the animal's back as he careered off homewards as fast as his legs could carry him. When they got home, he fell down in the yard and lay there panting for breath. Everyone recognized that the white cloud was the spirit of the murdered man and would have smothered them to death if it could. The dead were the object of fears and superstitions, many of which were picked up from whites. Never answer the first time your name is called, according to the proverbial wisdom, for it may be a ghost or spirit calling, and if you answer it, you will soon die. They never call a second time. The spirit of a dead person is dangerous immediately after death, and the clock and the mirror in the death chamber must be covered over so that the spirit cannot see them. Otherwise, the clock will never work again, and the mirror will show no more reflections. Wearing black for mourning stops the ghost from bothering you. It was just as bad luck in Georgia as it was in England or Scotland to meet a funeral procession head-on. It was necessary to turn round and look in the direction the procession was going. Witches were feared too. They liked to ride their victims in the night, leaving them exhausted in the morning with their hair tangled or their face scratched. The Ku Klux Klan adopted the robes and spooky headgear to frighten blacks into thinking they were evil spirits. Years later, in the 1930s, a Southern black remembered how, when he was a child, a gang of them arrived on horseback at the slave cabins, and the leader demanded a bucket of water. It was quickly brought to him, and he drank it down and 2 more after it. Then he just wiped his mouth and said, "Lordy, that sure was good. It was the first drink of water I's had since I was killed at the Battle of Shiloh." The trick with the water was worked by pouring it into a concealed leather bag inside the man's robe. Love and music. There were plenty of love charms and minor superstitions too, of the kind familiar in European tradition. To make someone love you, for instance, place some of his or her hair inside your hat or in the pocket nearest your heart. Tuesday is a lucky day for weddings. Do not step over someone lying down, or any illness he is suffering will be transferred to you. If you kill a snake and leave it lying on its back, it will bring rain. In music, the mingling of African and European elements fathered a new and vigorous Afro-American musical tradition, beginning with spirituals in the religious sphere and with work songs and ragtime in the secular. The first collection of plantation spirituals, slave songs of the United States, came out in 1867 and aroused tremendous interest. 5 years later, Fisk University formed a choir, the Jubilee Singers, to tour the country performing spirituals and raising money for the institution, and other black universities followed their example. Since those days, songs like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," "He's Got the Whole World in His Hand," or "When the Saints Go Marching In," have carried Afro-American music to the 4 corners of the earth, and the black American influence on this century's music has been vital and profound. Heroes and villains. Just as white American society created folk heroes of wildly exaggerated physical attributes, so did black. The legendary John Henry, for instance, who pitted his giant strength against the white man's steam drill and died with his hammer in his hand, was a real man who was transformed into a mythical titan. Or there was the formidable Annie Christmas, who weighed more than 250 pounds, stood 6 foot 8 inches, and boasted a moustache and a voice like a foghorn. She worked as a Mississippi longshoreman and could carry a barrel of flour under each of her massive arms and another barrel on her head. Annie could outdrink any man in the South. She had 12 black sons, all born at once, and each 7 feet tall. When she died, her body was placed in a coal-black coffin and taken to the wharf in a coal-black hearse, drawn by 6 coal-black horses. Her coal-black sons marched with her, 6 on each side, in coal-black suits. At the wharf by moonlight, the coffin was placed in a coal-black barge, and the 12 sons climbed aboard and floated out on the water and were never seen again. As white folk tradition made heroes of real-life criminals and outlaws, so too did black. An example is Railroad Bill, real name Morris Slater, who robbed freight trains in the South for 3 years before he was finally ambushed and killed by law officers in 1896. He would break open crates of canned food and other goods on board and throw his booty onto the track, later returning to pick it up and sell it to local blacks. His ability to elude capture inspired the belief that he was a powerful conjureman who could change shape into a fox or a sheep or a dog whenever he wished. According to legend, he was a dead shot and a bold adventurer. Railroad Bill, he went down. Shot all the teeth out of the constable's mouth. Wasn't he bad? Wasn't he bad? Wasn't he bad? Many other black bad men became heroes of folk tradition. Stackerly, John Hardy, Harry Duncan, George Devil Winston, and numerous others, and many of them too were credited with supernatural abilities. Stackerly, who, according to legend, came into the world with a caul over his face and a full mouthful of teeth, later sold his soul to the devil in return for magic powers and wore a magic Stetson hat with which his power was bound up. In their defiance of the law and the odds against them, their guile and their ruthless violence, the bad men are in the same mold as the trickster hero who lives by the principle of the survival of the fittest. They too reflect black American experience of long years of oppression. Here is my attempt to repair the text without rewriting or adding my own content. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettis. Heim was born at Cologne in 1488 and died in 1535, almost certainly at Grenoble. His books on magic and occultism were widely known, and he was both famous and infamous at the courts and universities of Western Europe. His real name was Heinrich Cornels. After the fashion of the time, he Latinized Cornels into Cornelius and awarded himself the bogus noble title of Agrippa von Nettesheim, from the Roman founder of Cologne and the name of a place near Cologne. Undisciplined, unstable, and erratically brilliant, Agrippa was often forced to live by his wits and played at different times the roles of occult scholar and alchemist, faith healer and demonologist, court astrologer, theologian, lawyer and doctor, historian, town orator, financial advisor, and secret political agent. He worked now for the Pope and now for his rival the Emperor, switching sides as opportunity offered. He founded secret societies whose members he was not above exploiting. He mixed with royalty at one moment, only to find himself in prison for debt the next. Agrippa moved restlessly about Europe until his enemies caught him at Grenoble, imprisoned and tortured him, and left him so broken that he only survived his release a matter of weeks. Much of his career is shrouded in mystery, and even before his death he had become the center of stories in which he figured as a master black magician. Goethe drew on some of these for the title character of his play, Faust. Agrippa's best-known work, De Occulta Philosophia, Occult Philosophy, was published in 3 volumes in 1531, but had been written much earlier, in 1510, possibly during a sojourn in England. It is based on ideas current at the time. That man is a miniature version of God, made in his image, that the whole universe, taken together, is God, and that man is therefore a miniature copy of the universe. The universe, the macrocosm, or great world, is built on the model of man, the microcosm, or small world, and so, like man, it has a soul. Agrippa says that everything which exists has a soul, or spiritual component, part of the total world soul, which shows itself in the magical properties of herbs, metals, stones, animals, and other phenomena of nature. For instance, the magnet attracts iron. Whoever wears the stone called heliotrope becomes invisible, and a sure contraceptive for a woman is to drink mule's urine every month, because mules are sterile. Agrippa considers the relationship between matter and spirit in the light of various arts and sciences, including music, geometry, and, especially important, astrology. Then he turns to the human soul and its relationship to the body, as revealed by necromancy, the summoning up of the spirits of the dead, and in the religions of all ages. Agrippa builds up a system of the universe in which everything is part of a great spiritual whole, which is God. Magic is the way of investigating this system, but magic is only for the initiated few, for men like Agrippa himself, members, as most of them were in fact, of secret societies. He does not press the point fully home, but his conclusion that man containeth in himself all things which are in God is well in line with the magical theory that the magician can make himself God and wield the supreme power of God in the universe. Agrippa's other main work forms a complete contrast to his first one, written in 1526, at a time when his fortunes were at a low ebb, and published 3 years later. De incertitudine et vanitate scientiarum et artium, the uncertainty and vanity of the sciences and arts, maintains that on balance the arts and sciences are harmful to man, through an encyclopedic review of all the sciences and arts known to him, which provides a mine of information and builds up a fascinating mirror to the culture of the times. Agrippa contrasts the disillusion which all this knowledge brings with the spiritual strength gained through the only sure and beneficial thing on which man can rely, the divinely revealed Word of God. Agrippa is rarely an original thinker, and his philosophy is a compilation of ideas from many sources. He ransacked the works of writers, ancient and modern, for ideas which he adapted in a tremendous display of erudition to his own magical system. But second-hand though much of his occult lore is, it is shot through with moments of genuine poetic utterance. Of his contemporaries, Paracelsus was by far the greater genius, but Agrippa, with his virtues and vices, provides the best mirror to the social and intellectual ferment of his time. One of the many stories told about Agrippa was that he went out one day, leaving the key to a secret room in the house with his wife. She foolishly lent it to the lodger, a student, who went into the room and found a huge book of spells, which he began to read. After a while, he looked up and found a demon standing in front of him, asking why it had been summoned. He gaped at it in horror, and the demon strangled him. Agrippa returned and, fearing a charge of murder, made the demon restore the student to life for a few hours. The young man was seen walking in the street, but when the demon's magic wore off, he collapsed. To rent the sky the dew that befouled it, I have riled the fire, pierced open the earth's the triumphant Tvasrian, the power of evil in the old Zoroastrian religion. But his triumph brings its own defeat when evil has eaten up everything it can and has nothing left to destroy but itself. Ahriman for centuries. Iran has been a Muslim country, but before the Muslim conquest, the state religion was Zoroastrianism. Ahriman is the Zoroastrian devil, not the Muslim one, whose name is Shaitan, more familiar to us as Satan. We first hear of Ahriman in the 7th century BC when he plays a significant part in the Gathas, or songs, of Zoroaster, the prophet of ancient Iran and the founder of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is generally held to be a classical form of religious dualism. That is to say, it holds that the universe is not the creation of one God or principle, but of two, a holy power and an evil one. Some religions identify evil with matter, with what Christians call the flesh. But in Zoroastrianism, matter, far from being evil, is the creation of the holy God and is therefore in itself entirely good. Evil is a spiritual power, negative and destructive. It is called the lie, and is the principle of disruption and death, the adversary of truth. In the Gathas, there is the basic dualism between truth and the lie. These are principles that exist in opposition to each other for all time. Of the origin of the lie, nothing is said. Truth, however, is seen as an aspect of the one true God, or Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. Twice it is called his son. If the lie is the principle of evil, Ahriman is its personification. He is not yet the eternal adversary of the one God, but he is the eternal adversary of an entity called the Holy Spirit. From the beginning, the two spirits face each other in implacable hostility. But evidently, there was a beginning, for the Holy Spirit, like God the Son in Christian theology, was born of the Father and it appears that he was also the twin brother of the evil spirit. In the beginning, those two spirits, who are the well-endowed twins, were known as the one good and the other evil, in thought, word, and deed. Between them, the wise chose rightly, not so the fools, and when these spirits met, they established in the beginning life and death, so that in the end, the followers of the lie should meet with the worst existence, but the followers of truth with the best mind. Of these two spirits, he who was of the lie chose to do the worst things, but the most Holy Spirit, clothed in rugged heaven, chose truth, as did all who sought with zeal to do the pleasure of the wise Lord by doing good works. Between the two, sinners did not choose rightly, for as they continued, delusion overcame them, so that they followed the most evil mind. Then did the one accord rush headlong to fury, so that they might thereby extinguish the existence of mortal men. From this passage, two facts emerge. First, the two spirits are twins, and since Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, is the father of the holy, it follows that he must also be the father of the evil one. Secondly, the evil spirit, though he is of the lie, must choose evil. He is not evil absolutely, but becomes evil by choice. Once the choice is made, however, he is no more capable of change than is Satan in the Christian tradition. He is forever committed to the lie. Declaration of war. Zoroastrianism is, above all, the religion of free will. Not only is Ahriman, the evil spirit, evil by choice, and the Holy Spirit holy by choice, but the one supreme God, Ahura Mazda, has also to commit himself, has to choose between truth and the lie. Ahura Mazda chooses truth. Holy and good right-mindedness do we choose. Let it be ours. This is a declaration of war on the lie and those who have chosen the lie. On both sides, this is an irrevocable decision, and the battle must be fought to the finish. In the Gathas, then, which are now generally admitted to be the work of the prophet Zoroaster himself, the supreme God aligns himself with the Holy Spirit against the power of the lie. The evil spirit, on the other hand, chooses to lead the power of the lie against the Holy Spirit and, therefore, against the supreme God. But, though he is the sworn enemy of the Holy Spirit, he is also his twin and must, therefore, also be the son of his father, the wise Lord. Would it not, then, be more accurate to say that the Zoroastrianism of Zoroaster is not a dualism at all, but a form of monotheism, belief in one God, at least in the sense that the wise Lord is the first cause of all things? In later times, the Zoroastrians became divided on this issue. A purely dualist solution was favored by the fact that, in the course of time, the Holy Spirit was simply identified with the wise Lord. The name Ahura Mazda took on its later form Ormazd, and Ormazd and Ahriman then appeared as independent principles, eternally separate and distinct, eternally opposed. This is the form of Zoroastrianism that we meet with in the Sasanian period, from the 2nd to the 7th centuries AD, when the Persian Empire was revived under the House of Sasan, and Zoroastrianism became the official religion of the empire. By this time, Ahriman had grown in stature. He had become an independent monarch who held undisputed sway in his own kingdom of darkness and death. But the myth of the two eternal twins lingered on, because the problem of evil is at the very center of Zoroastrianism. Our experience of life seems to show that if God is all-powerful, he cannot be absolutely good, because he lets evil exist, and, conversely, if he is absolutely good, he cannot be all-powerful, because he evidently cannot prevent evil. A cut-and-dried dualism absolves God from any responsibility for evil, however indirect, but he necessarily pays for his goodness at the price of his omnipotence. But if the old legend of the primordial twins was retained, and since the wise Lord and the Holy Spirit were not identified in the single person of Ormazd, could it not be that these twin poles of good and evil themselves derived their being from a neutral principle which was the origin of unity? Such a principle some of the Zoroastrian theologians thought they had found in infinite time, which was also infinite space, and which they called by its ancient name Zurvan. The myth was, therefore, modified to suit this new theology. It has totally disappeared from the Zoroastrian texts of the period, but it is preserved in Christian and other sources and is certainly authentic. The myth that has come down to us is a popular presentation of a far more subtle theological position, which seeks at all costs to preserve both the original unity and the absolute goodness of Ormazd, Zurvan, and the birth of evil. The myth says that the great god Zurvan existed before there was anything else. He offered a sacrifice so that he might have a son, but after a long time he began to wonder whether his hopes were in vain. As soon as this thought occurred to him, Ormazd and Ahriman were conceived, Ormazd because of Zurvan's sacrifice, and Ahriman because of his doubt. Zurvan decided that whichever of them came to him first, he would make king. When Ahriman heard this, he ripped the womb open, emerged, and advanced towards his father. Zurvan, seeing him, asked, "Who are you?" And he replied, "I am your son, Ormazd." And Zurvan said, "My son is light and fragrant, but you are dark and stinking." And he wept most bitterly. And as they were talking together, Ormazd was born in his turn, light and fragrant, and Zurvan, seeing him, knew that it was his son Ormazd, for whom he had offered sacrifice. And he said to him, "Up till now it is I who have offered sacrifice for you. From now you shall offer sacrifice for me." But Ahriman drew near and said to him, "Did you not vow that whichever of your sons should come to you first, to him you would give the kingdom?" And Zurvan said to him, "O false and wicked one, the kingdom shall be granted you for 9,000 years. But Ormazd I have made a king above you, and after 9,000 years he will reign and do everything according to his good pleasure." And Ormazd created the heavens and the earth and all things that are beautiful and good. But Ahriman created the demons and all that is evil and perverse. Ormazd created riches, Ahriman poverty. Ahriman is born of Zurvan's doubt and rules the world, but only for 9,000 years. This partial solution of the problem of evil, which made the evil one prince of his world, if only for a relatively short time, did not in the end satisfy the majority of Zoroastrians. The myth of the primordial twins was set aside, and the universe was indeed divided into two separate halves, light and darkness, good and evil. In the beginning, the light was above, and the darkness beneath, and between them was the void. Ormazd in the light, and Ahriman in the darkness. Ormazd knew of the existence of Ahriman, but Ahriman did not know the existence and light of Ormazd. He soon found out. Roaming around in his dismal kingdom, he reached the upper confines of his realm and saw a ray of light. He longed to get hold of it and to destroy it. Ormazd, in his goodness, offered him peace, which the evil one summarily rejected, and leaped forward to attack the light. Ormazd replied to him, laid him low by the pure power of the law, and hurled him back into the darkness. There he lay unconscious for over 3,000 years. Having foiled this first onslaught, Ormazd realized that he must create a bastion between himself and Ahriman, the eternal aggressor. For this purpose, he first created a spiritual universe, which is an ideal model of the material universe, then the material world itself. The ideal world was to remain forever free from the pestilential attacks of Ahriman, and at its summit were the souls of the human race. When Ahriman's attack on the material world took place, it was Ormazd's plan that these souls should acquire bodies and go to live in the world to do battle with Ahriman and the lie. But Ormazd demands the free cooperation of man. He does not, and will not violate the freedom of man's will. He took counsel with the consciousness and pre-existent souls of men and infused omniscient wisdom into them, saying, "Which seems more profitable to you, whether that I should fashion you forth in material form, and that you should strive incarnate with the lie and destroy it, and that we should resurrect you at the end, whole and immortal, and recreate you in material form, and that you should eternally be immortal, unaging, and without enemies, or that you should eternally be preserved from the aggressor." And the pre-existent souls of men saw by that omniscient wisdom that they would suffer evil from the lie and Ahriman in the material world, but because at the end they would be resurrected free from the enmity of the aggressor, whole and immortal forever and ever, they agreed to go into the material world. For the defeat and destruction of Ahriman then, man's cooperation is essential. Man must become mortal and accept bodily existence in order in the end to annihilate the force of destruction, death, and all evil. Once the souls have consented to this, Ormazd creates the material world. He creates the sky, water, plants, the animals in the shape of the lone created bull, and finally the first man, Gaomart, shining like the sun. All is now in readiness, and Ahriman prepares his attack. It is devastatingly successful. Each of Ormazd's creations he defiles and corrupts. He slays the bull and mortally wounds Gaomart. His triumph seems to be complete, and he cries out in savage exultation, "Perfect is my victory, for I have rent the sky. I have befooled it with murk and darkness. I have made it my stronghold. I have befooled the waters, pierced open the earth, and befooled it with darkness. I have dried up the plants and brought death to the bull, sickness to Gaomart. I have seized the kingdom. On the side of Ormazd, none remains to do battle except only man. And man, isolated and alone, what can he do?" But Gaomart's seed had fallen into the earth as he died, and from his seed sprang up a rhubarb plant which split in two to form the first human couple. The human race was, therefore, saved to continue the long, arduous battle against evil which it had already freely accepted. Moreover, the material universe was bounded by the sky which Ahriman had rent open, forgetting that it was made of shining metal that is the substance of steel. He has entered into his kingdom, but the kingdom is his prison. This does not matter so long as he, and the vices he has brought in his train, can prey upon the creatures of Ormazd. But in the end, evil, which is of its nature destructive, finding that Ormazd's creation is slowly slipping from its grasp, will be forced to disrupt and destroy itself. Ahriman and the demons in the world are like wild beasts that have broken into a garden, but once they have wreaked all the destruction they can, they find that they have been trapped. They make frantic efforts to get out, and in doing so, they use their strength against themselves and ensure their own destruction. The end of the lie. Ahriman's end comes about when Ormazd's creation has become so spiritualized as to escape his power. Pandemonium then breaks out. Demon attacks demon, each destroying the other until only Ahriman and Az, the demon of death, greed, and lust, are left. Az turns on Ahriman and threatens to swallow him, and Ahriman is forced to appeal to his eternal enemy to deliver him from his former ally. Ormazd will not relent. The spirit of obedience destroys the threatening demon Az, and Ormazd himself lays Ahriman low. Does this mean that Ahriman is finally annihilated? According to popular mythology, yes. He is dragged outside the sky and has his head cut off. But according to more sophisticated accounts, he cannot be annihilated because he is the substance of evil, and, according to the particular brand of philosophy the Zoroastrians had adopted, a substance by definition cannot be destroyed. The technical term used means literally to put out of action. He is thrown out of the sky through the hole by which he rushed in, and at that hole he is laid low and knocked unconscious, so that he will never arise again. He forever powerless, and, as it were, slain, and henceforth neither he nor his creation will exist. With his destruction, a new heaven and a new earth are created. All men are resurrected, and those who were confined to hell are released from their torments, and all enjoy perpetual bliss forevermore in the company of Ormazd, the wise Lord. While he still exists as a conscious being, Ahriman is intensely active in this world. He is the adversary of both God and man, the destroyer, the author of death, a liar and a deceiver. His aim is to deceive men as to the true nature of God, and so to bring them to hate Ormazd and to love himself. By these means, he entices them into hell, of which he is the overlord. In fact, he is not the equal of Ormazd, and never really stands a chance, because he comes to know things too late. So he is defeated as much by his own stupidity as by Ormazd's wisdom and power. Rampant sexuality, torrents of filthy language, and extraordinary bodily contortions are nowadays associated with hysteria and other mental disorders. In the 17th century, they were put down to possession by devils. In the first 25 years of the 17th century, the witchcraft delusion in France reached its high peak of intensity. A characteristic feature of the period was the prevalence of cases of demonic possession, involving priests and nuns. Demons were believed to be attacking the human race, obsessing the minds and controlling the bodies of victims into whom they had entered through bodily orifices. In a reign of terror against every form of demonism, the inquisitors attempted to withstand what they believed to be a mass assault levelled at the church and society by the devil, working through his agents, sorcerers and witches. In the year 1609, at Aix-en-Provence, in southern France, Madeleine de Demandos de la Palude began to show signs of diabolic invasion. In 1605, she had been admitted to the Ursuline convent at Aix, but had been returned to the care of her parents, a well-established Provençal family, to recover from the attacks of depression that afflicted her when away from home. Unfortunately, she fell under the influence of Father Louis Gaufridi, the parish priest of Occult in Marseille, and a friend of the family. Like many clerics of that age, Gaufridi was far from ascetic in his way of life. Several women were known to be infatuated with him, and his services as a confessor were particularly in demand among the wives of the citizens. The age difference between Gaufridi and Madeleine, he was 34, she was 13, did not deter the priest. His visits became increasingly frequent, and he was often alone with her for extended periods. Inevitably, she fell violently in love with him. The story soon reached the ears of Catherine de Gorma, the head of the Ursuline convent at Marseille, who warned Madeleine's mother about the dangers to which her daughter was exposed, and a hint was conveyed to the priest to seize his attentions immediately. In the following year, Madeleine was admitted to the Ursuline convent at Marseille under the direct control of Mother de Gorma, to whom she revealed the full story of her relations with Gaufridi. She claimed that they had involved sexual intercourse since her childhood. Father Gaufridi was questioned about his sexual relations with Madeleine and insisted that his association with her had been proper in every respect. However, further exorcisms brought from the mouth of the possessed girl damning accusations that Gaufridi was a devil worshipper and had copulated with her since she was 13. The situation at the convent was now getting out of hand, as 3 more nuns were possessed by devils, and by the end of the year, the number had risen to 8. The most severely afflicted of these was Sister Louise Capot, whose ravings and contortions were even more hideous than Madeleine's. Reduced to desperation, Father Comelon sought the aid of one of the most famous witch hunters of the age, the Grand Inquisitor Sebastian Michaelis. The Flemish exorcist, Father Domptius, was also called in, and managed to produce from the mouth of Louise the harsh, blaspheming howls of 3 terrifying devils by the names Grésil, Sonilon, and Véran, each of whom was high in the hierarchy of hell. It was Véran who accused Gaufridi of causing Madeleine's condition, revealing that no less than 666 evil spirits were now in possession of her body. Father Gaufridi was summoned from his parish and ordered to exorcise Louise Capot. No expert in this highly specialized treatment, he failed miserably and heard himself denounced as a sorcerer and cannibal by the demons he was struggling to expel. Meanwhile, the possessed nun Louise attempted to outdo Madeleine by loudly insisting that Gaufridi had committed every imaginable sexual perversion. The alarmed authorities immediately ordered the priest's rooms to be searched for magical objects or books, but were surprised and disappointed to discover nothing incriminating. Learning from those who knew him that he was well regarded in his parish, they released him and let him return there. Here he clamoured for vindication of his good name and demanded that his accusers lie punished. Throughout this period, Madeleine never ceased to be racked in body and spirit by the tormenting devils, and the convent was in complete disarray as a result of her ravings, obscenities, and accusations against Gaufridi. Overwhelmed by the furious demons within her, she sometimes neighed like a horse, while her bones creaked and groaned like a tree bending before a storm. The case of the possessed nuns of Aix was now rocking France. On one side stood Gaufridi, insisting upon vindication, and on the other the Grand Inquisitor Michaelis, determined to bring Gaufridi to trial. The result was predictable. In 1611, the case came before a court in Aix, and although he could not at first have realized it, the priest's doom was sealed. The behavior in court of the 2 nuns, Madeleine and Louise, was, by 17th century standards, typical of an advanced state of diabolical possession. Madeleine was often demented, shrieking, crying, and alternating between violent denunciations of Gaufridi as a devil worshipper and wizard, and the complete retraction of the same accusations. Then she would return to the charge of cannibalism. Much he cares for your saltfish or your eggs. He eats the good smoking flesh of little children, which is brought to him invisibly from the Sabbath, she said. During the trial, it became painfully obvious to those present that the girl was experiencing an orgasm. In their eyes, her convulsions represented a sexual act, with violent movements of every part of her body. She twice attempted suicide. During the course of the trial, it was discovered that she possessed devil's marks on her body, the secret brands by which Satan recognized his own. These marks later vanished in a mysterious fashion. Gaufridi was brought into court, shattered by the mental anguish and physical tortures he had suffered in prison. His body had been shaved and searched for devil's marks, 3 of which had been found as further evidence against him. To complete his misery, a pact with Satan signed in his own blood was produced in court, under the terms of which all women were to be made subject to his will. It was common knowledge that the pact with the devil required the surrender of the body and soul of a witch or sorcerer at the end of 20 years, but with true legalistic formality, it was conceded that, should the pact be written on virgin parchment, or prepared outside the magic circle, the agreement was null and void. Such contracts between a sorcerer and Satan were sometimes written and invariably signed in blood. In return for his soul, the sorcerer would receive some specific gift or power. There is no evidence that the agreement afforded any protection against the Inquisition, however, for Satan only rarely intervened on behalf of his dupe. Gaufridi's confession, which he had signed in prison, reflected the morbid state of mind of his accusers rather than that of the accused. He said he had eaten babies and celebrated a black mass at the Sabbath, where he held the rank of prince of the synagogue, sprinkling the witches with consecrated wine, and he had exercised his magical power over women. More than 1,000 persons have been poisoned by the irresistible attraction of my breath, which filled them with passion. he confessed. Gaufridi strenuously repudiated the confession in court, declaring it to consist of fantasies in the minds of the inquisitors, extorted from him by torture. But protest was useless. The confession and the pact were sufficient to secure a verdict of guilty from the witch-fearing judges of the 17th century. Gaufridi was found guilty and condemned to death by fire. He was to be burned slowly over a pyre of bushes instead of logs, so that his anguish would be prolonged. After the torture, the shattered body of the still-living Gaufridi was dragged on a hurdle through the streets for 5 hours, escorted by archers. Arriving at the place of execution, the priest was granted the unexpected mercy of strangulation before the fire was lit, thus escaping the ultimate horror of the original sentence. His lifeless body was then burned to ashes. As if by the influence of a magic charm, Madeleine suddenly became free of her tormenting devils, thus disposing of any doubts that may have remained about Gaufridi's guilt. Her fellow demoniac, Louise Gapeau, was less fortunate, for she was harassed by demons to the end of her days, while the devil mania itself spread to the nuns of other convents before it finally subsided. Madeleine, however, never escaped from the watchful eyes of the Inquisition. Once the taint of diabolic possession had become associated with an individual, no one really knew what infamies the devils might venture on next. A generation after Gaufridi's execution, the year 1642 saw her defending herself with difficulty against a charge of witchcraft. 10 years later, she was prosecuted again, and this time, incriminated by the devil's marks, which had reappeared on her body, she was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. She was released at an advanced age into the custody of a relative. Madeleine de Demandol found freedom at last in death in 1670 at the age of 77. Eric Maple.